Good morning. My name is Chip Calderon. I work with the Bureau of Justice Assistance and CNA on the Smart Policing Initiative as Director Coordinator of Training and Technical Assistance Services. We have with us today Scott Decker from Arizona State University, the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice, who's going to lead a webinar on targeting high-risk offenders. So I'm going to turn this over to him in a minute. I just want to say a few words by way of introduction. First, it looks like we have a really good group and a sizable group of people here this morning, so I appreciate that. Thank you all for joining us. You probably know this, but I need to repeat that this webinar is recorded. So we make these available through our website after they're completed. So just be mindful of what you say. We will be sending out a brief evaluation form after the webinar to get your thoughts about it and any other suggestions you have for how we run the webinars or other webinars that we might develop. And I believe the folks from CNA are going to be sending you a brief question during my introductory remarks just to make sure they get your full name and your title or where you're from so we can account for that. And since we have a large number of people on the phone, it's not always that easy to have an ongoing debate and discussion during the webinar. So you'll see that there is a handy little chat function on the right-hand side of your screen. If you're not able to get your words in as we're talking, please feel free to make a comment or put a question up on the chat room, and we'll make sure that we either respond to it directly or at some point following the webinar. So we track those and we record those as well and review them to make sure that we answer everybody's questions. If anybody's having trouble with their audio or getting linked up, please just contact Vivian or Zoe, who are on the line here, and they can help you. Other than that, I do want to say that we have an ongoing series of webinars that Smart Policing. Some of you have taken part in them, I know, because I recognize your names. Others you may have not, but if you go to our website, you'll see that you can view them, and in the next month or so, we'll be presenting a webinar on technology. We're developing a new one on how to be a smart police officer. So we're taking a look at what our sites have learned and creating a webinar for specifically for police officers and police personnel who are working in smart policing projects. We have Hildy Sizo on the line here, who has offered a webinar before on outreach and collaboration. She'll be doing that webinar again sometime soon. John Eck is going to return sometime early fall to do an update on his webinar around problem places. I'll be teaming up with Mike Scott from Arizona in the next couple months, and we're going to put together basically a different kind of webinar that allows the participants to run the show, and we will just act as facilitators. So we're going to do one of those on the SARA model and problem-oriented policing, which you'll get a notice about fairly soon. So these webinars have attracted a lot of interest. We think they're a good vehicle for getting information across and getting sites to talk to each other. Again, I'm glad that you're here. Scott Decker has presented on this topic before. It's a very popular topic among the sites. It has to do with targeting high-risk offenders and maintaining lists and managing those lists, and talking a little bit about how these can be helpful for your smart policing initiative, looking at what some of the other sites are doing along these lines. So most of you know him. If you don't, you'll find him very informative, and I like to think of him as a university professor who gets it and who knows how to talk to real people and do real research out in the real world. So let me turn this over to Scott, and again, thanks everybody for your attention. Scott?
Thank you very much, Chip, and welcome everybody. Let me add as well that once the webinar is over, if a question arises or you're with your team and you go back to the slides and consult them and you have an additional question, please don't hesitate to contact me via email. I'm one of the subject matter experts with the BJA Smart Policing Project through CNA. And I think perhaps one of the reasons why so many people signed up was because of the website that CNA has developed for this project that has so many good pieces of information. I was looking at it the other day and found it really useful and easy to use and practical, and I took a couple hints that I'm going to use the next time I work with the team. So why don't we go ahead and get started here. And if we move to the first slide, problem selection and analysis, you'll see, this is where we start with SPI. Unlike a number of other projects that you may know about, and certainly a couple I've been involved in, where it seemed the strategy was ready, fire, aim, SPI is a project where problem selection and analysis needs to be done carefully. I think it's for the newer grantees, I think it's often the case that we want to really impress our grant monitor and our supervisors and let them know just how much we're getting accomplished right out of the box in that first month or so. And I think that's often where interventions go wrong. And SPI recognizes that starting with very careful problem selection and definition and analysis is an important first step for this. This focuses attention on the crime triangle, persons, places, and things I like to call criminal commodities, like weapons or drugs or perhaps goods sold illegally. And when we do that, one of the things we find when we look across a large number of interventions is that we see a lot of conclusions where the analysis finds a small number of offenders account for a disproportionately large amount of crime. And the information is on a slide a couple down, but the classic finding in criminology in Philadelphia was 6% of the juveniles who appeared before the juvenile court accounted for more than half of all the crimes committed. So if we wanted to do something about juvenile crime in Philadelphia, those 6%, in a sense, have identified themselves as high-rate offenders. And if we could do something to tamp down their offending, we could get rid of half of the juvenile crime in Philadelphia by dealing with a really small number, only 6% of the juveniles. So that really emphasizes the fact that targeting is important because it produces outcomes, but it is also an effective way to use resources. And as we move to the next slide, as we all know, in these difficult economic times, one of the challenges we face is to use our resources more efficiently so that we get more bang for every law enforcement or criminal justice or public safety dollar that we spend. Offender targeting calls us to identify chronic, high-rate, troublesome offenders or places. In the District of Columbia, one of the sort of parallel analyses to that showed we have high-rate offenders, we also have high-rate places. 2% of the addresses in the District of Columbia accounted for over 80% of the police calls for service. If we don't have enough resources and we're trying to do things in an efficient manner, then we need to look for those very small number of persons or places where high-rate offenders and problems congregate in large numbers. So we would identify, using the District of Columbia example, we would identify those locations. Maybe we'd park a squad car out front. Maybe we'd have increased police presence. Maybe we'd find out what's going on in that neighborhood. But that kind of analysis leads us to the foundation for targeting high-rate offenders. And what we want to do then is not just be satisfied with that identification, but move ahead to link that to prosecution, enforcement, supervision, and intervention. Maybe it means we take a look at where probationers and parolees who get arrested live. Perhaps they're congregated in the same neighborhoods. Well, that allows us to bring in our partners in probation and parole. It may allow us to bring in people from the city housing code. And so offender targeting in the end is a smart policing practice that uses resources where they will do the most good. And one of the other ways we can enhance the impact of smart policing generally, but certainly offender targeting, is to involve community members in your policing strategy. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. This is an issue that needs to be approached with some thought and consideration. And if we move to the next slide, we can start to think about some of those reasons. Well, why would we employ offender targeting as part of our smart policing strategy? Well, if we've done the analysis and we know that there's either a small number of addresses that account for a large volume of calls for service or arrest, or a small number of individuals who disproportionately account for a large amount of our crime, it allows us to focus our efforts. It allows the police to concentrate specifically on a set number of addresses. It's results-driven, and that's something that's right at the core of a smart policing initiative. But I think there's a number of other things that are often not thought of as primary benefits to offender targeting, but really need to be. The first of those, and I think it's really important, and I've seen it work effectively in a number of jurisdictions, is that it enhances officer safety. So that if an officer has, ideally, an electronic list of high-rate offenders in a neighborhood, and they stop someone and run their pedigree, and they get a hit back, they would know that they're facing an individual who poses danger. They could call for backup. They could take additional safety steps. It also demonstrates offender targeting to the community that we're really serious about going after the most serious crime problems, that we're not just kind of picking the low-hanging fruit, so to speak. It focuses resources on high-rate offenders, and that's a real important way to do strategic deterrence and lever pulling. And finally, and I think this is a really important point, and we'll be having a LinkedIn discussion about this in the middle of May, offender targeting allows us to produce sustainable interventions. We are all concerned, whether we're in a local SPI site or subject matters or CNA or especially BJA, with producing results and producing interventions that will go beyond the expenditure of the last dollar of the grant. We want to see something change, and offender targeting high-rate offenders, is a strategy that can produce results and therefore become a sustainable strategy even after the last dollar is spent and the last webinar is signed on to. If we go to the next slide, we're at the first of a couple of what we call stop and thinks. And a stop and think allows us to reflect back on the preceding slides, but also to kind of foreshadow what's to come. And I would pose a couple questions to the group, and maybe we are a large group this morning, but maybe we'll get some responses here. So, you know, a problem that many cities and many jurisdictions face is there's a spike in a particular crime. And the example here in our stop and think is street robbery. What would your first step be if you confronted an increase in street robbery in a particular neighborhood? Well, the non-smart policing initiative response might be saturation patrol, flood the neighborhood with cars, and while that might be an appropriate response, it's also the case that one of the first things we ought to do is better understand the nature of that problem. What time do those street robberies occur? Do they have a similar MO? Do the victims share anything in common? What are the characteristics of the place? Where is it outside of ATMs? Is it outside of bars as they close at 2 a.m. or 4 a.m. or whatever time it would be? So the first question leads to the second question, and that is, what kind of information do you need to better understand the problem? Some of the information might not be readily available. So you would have an intervention, you would begin to target street robbery, but you'd be gathering other information to find out maybe there are liquor licenses that have been abused and the rules aren't being followed by certain saloons or taverns or bars, and the Alcoholic Beverage Commission could crack down and really help clean up that problem. So other information is going to broaden our view of the picture and enhance our ability to intervene. How would you go about determining if there are high-rate offenders? Of course, unless arrests are made, we really don't know a lot about the offenders except through the victims and what we learn from victims, which is another important thing that we need to do, is link information across cases. There's real power in linking information across cases. And it's often the case that in the criminal justice system, we think about things one case at a time, as opposed to linking the information from multiple cases across each other. And if you saw Julie Wartel's or heard Julie Wartel's recent webinar on crime analysis, clearly that's one of the things that she emphasized, the linking information across cases. Also the case, we want to think about additional partners. Smart policing is not only law enforcement. Smart policing means using other partners and bringing their resources and their insights to bear on solving our crime problems. If we move on to the next slide, we talk about who is targeted. And when we do move on to the next slide to talk about who is targeted, there we go, the bullseye. What we're looking for, and I think the bullseye is appropriate in a way, if we think about those circles and look at the one right in the middle that's got, I think, the dart in it, if that little dot in the middle represents the high rate group of offenders, maybe they're 5 or 10% of the total, but they account for 60% of all the crime or more. If we do something about that group, we're going to be effective. So that really points to the importance of analysis, and good analysis that allows us, because the better we're able to identify that group, the more effectively we're going to be able to intervene. We're looking for is offenders who've been chronic problems in the criminal justice system and haven't really been affected much by our other interventions. And that's a real polite way to say we're looking for those real pain-in-the-neck offenders that we just can't, we know are involved, but we just haven't got the right strategy to address. We also want to look for offenders who reside or commit in the target area. Look, the extent to which we define an area to intervene is going to make us more successful. And it's our job to improve the lives of the people, young and old, working and retired, school children and seniors who live in those communities and are affected by crime on a daily basis. People who are afraid to go to the store or worry when they go out to get in their car or don't let their children walk to school. Our job is to improve the quality of life for those people and make them safer. One of the groups we often look at are probationers or parolees. Indeed, by their convictions, they've demonstrated to us that they've engaged in a certain level of crime already. And they're typically a group that's looked at first. Moving on to the next slide, we begin to talk about how that high rate group is targeted. And again, this is a real nice link back to Julie Wartel's webinar on crime analysis. And I think just as we in smart policing like to think about linking information across groups and cases, you as participants may want to think about linking information across from one webinar and one presentation to the next. We need an objective set of criteria to identify these individuals. If we identify them by saying, yeah, we all know it's Joe Bag of Donuts who's our biggest problem, and we all vote and raise our hand and put Joe on the list, it's a real difficult thing to defend to the media or to legal challenges, or I think equally importantly, to community groups. Most jurisdictions have used objective criteria such as multiple arrests, committing offenses while under supervision, specific offenses like gun assaults, a number of convictions. I know a number of jurisdictions have looked at warrants. It's not a simple analysis, but I know 2 jurisdictions that have looked at outstanding warrants. St. Louis, for example, had over 100,000 outstanding warrants. And so how do you figure out who to target? What they did was they arrayed individuals by the number of outstanding warrants. And they had people with 30, 40 outstanding warrants, and then they classified the people with the most outstanding warrants for felonies, and then that was their list. And they'd go down the list, and they'd take the first one, and they had individuals 6, 7, 8 outstanding warrants for felonies. Those were easy to identify as crime problems that they hadn't been able to get a handle on before. You want to include multiple agencies, whether it's police, prosecutors, probation, parole, and there'll be more on this later, but community groups can play an important part in that process as well. And you do need a threshold. So I talked before about warrants. Maybe it's people with 4 or more outstanding warrants that have been issued in a recent period, the last 6 months or so. So if this is a sense of how we target them, the next slide is developing the list. And we need to figure out how long that list is. In some cities, and I've worked with law enforcement who said, we got 2,000 guys that we could put on our list. Well, if your list is 2,000 people long, you're not going to be very successful, because 2,000 is just an unmanageable number. Depending on the city size, depending on your resources, depending on the severity of your crime problem, a manageable number might be 25 to 50. What specific information? Arrests, convictions. The more specific, the more validated the information is, the better it'll be. Some jurisdictions have combined subjective assessments with objective assessments. So a group of homicide detectives may know the names of individuals who weren't victims and who weren't offenders, but were at a number of homicide scenes, and they just didn't seem to make their way onto a suspect list. And they've been viewed as targets for high-rate offender lists. But again, you need some objective criteria as well. Some groups use points in order to establish their list. You want to figure how many jurisdictions should be involved. If you're a small suburban community in the midst of 15 or 20 or 30 other communities, you may want to include information from those other communities and as well as think about other agencies. If all you have is police information, you're not likely to have the most successful intervention. There's real, I want to stop it, and if you're taking notes, here's a place you might want to make a notation. This can be a really complex process. It should be thought out carefully, and this is also an area where using information from other jurisdictions and following their lead can pay off for you. It can give you some shortcuts to what's a complex and can be lengthy process. We move on now to the next slide. We're trying, as we go along, to maintain the validity of the list. And it's a truism that our list is only as good as the information we use to put it together in an honest and open dialogue. That means you got to take names off as they meet certain criteria, if they go away to prison, if they're locked up in jail for a while, or if they've gone a year or 6 months with no further crimes, maybe they ought to come off that list. But you also need to use current information. If you've got a list that's 6 months old and hasn't been updated, that list is not going to be as effective for you as a list that's much fresher. And again, before we move on to the next slide and talk about using the list, the more multiple sources and diverse sources you have, the more effective and useful your list will be. So we move on now to the process of using the list. And many of you may at this point be feeling a little frustration. You mean it's taken us all this work to get to the point where we can actually go out and implement our list? And I think, and the answer to that is yes. It's hard work. It takes a while. It's not a ready, fire, aim, because it's a practice that if developed and the development time and work is put in, it certainly can produce successful results. Lists ought to be shared with some restrictions. They ought to be made electronically available, perhaps on record management or CAD systems within law enforcement. Again, I mentioned the officer safety issue a little bit earlier, so that an officer who pulls up the name of someone who's on that list, there ought to be a flashing light, an alert, an underlined box that indicates this is a high-rate offender, so that they don't get ROR'd without the appropriate questions and intervention. Detective units, CID, the warrant squad can use the list. Narcotics, a number of other groups. We talked about officer safety. And I think, you know, the other thing that can be done with these lists, a number of jurisdictions are using these offender call-outs, where you call out a number of either high-rate offenders or probationers or recent parolees released from prison. You have these meetings with them to discuss prosecution, arrest, but also social service and employment. You may bring a member of their family. These high-rate offender lists may be combined with other strategies. And one of the points of smart policing is to think about the links between this initiative and other things going on in your jurisdiction. So let's move on now to our second stop and think of the webinar. So we might, you know, we got a large group on the line here. If I was going to say raise your hand, but that won't work on a webinar. If you have a list in your jurisdiction, just everybody who has a list now or is developing one, say yes. Yes. So we got a couple, and I suspect the format may have deterred some participation. But there are certain elements that can be very useful on those lists. For those of you, the first gentleman who indicated they had a list, what's good about your list? What's useful? I think maybe we'll look for these questions to be posted in the chat and maybe get to them at the end. And the questions on stop and think do point out, again, one of the important principles of smart policing, which is we learn from each other. If you're a second or third generation site, you stand on the shoulders of the other sites, and you can use the information that they developed to improve. This is one of those areas where copying from others is a good thing. We'll move on to operational questions. I think these are important to consider as you develop your list. The first of the operational questions is, do you tell offenders that they're on such a list? If we move on to the next slide, there we go. If you tell people that they're on a list, there's some deterrent value in letting them know, look, we're on a list, we're looking at you, be careful what you do, be careful who you hang out with, be careful where you go. On the other hand, maybe for investigative purposes, you don't want them to know. That question would be tailored to the nature of your intervention. How do you assure the public that this is not just another form of racial profiling? I've worked with jurisdictions that they used objective criteria, they got to the end of the process, and they took a look at it, and they said, oh man, everybody on this list is an African-American male, 22 to 30 years old. What's our response when people say this is racial profiling? I think this is an important question to think about and to address. Do we allow nominations? What role does probation and parole information? And then the final is the difficult question, and that's, what role does the community play? The community may be able to identify really problematic people, people who are bothering kids on the school bus and making senior citizens feel uncomfortable about going out at night and causing nuisances for businesses. And that information needs to be included in a way. And we'll move on to the next of the slides and talk about the role of technology. There's a webinar coming up on the role of technology, and if you saw the recent presentation about technology at the last Smart Policing conference, like I did, you're looking forward to this webinar. Technology can enhance our offender lists significantly, whether it's through alerts for officer safety or communication between different agencies. And I would also say that in this age of social networking, if we're not paying attention to what people use on Facebook and MySpace and MocoSpace and other social networking sites, we're missing a real opportunity to learn more about the people that we've targeted on our list, who aren't as good as protecting information about themselves as we might imagine. We move on to the challenges list before we get to a number of examples. And for challenges faced and overcome, this is a point in your intervention where I think it can be really useful to contact other sites that have done this before. Maintaining the confidentiality of the list is really important. Some groups have MOUs that all the partners sign that indicate that they won't share the information outside their group. Some groups have interviewed offenders about how they were caught and what they were afraid of. And one of the things that was found in a gun intervention was that offenders told interviewers they were more afraid of being caught on the street without their gun than they were afraid of being caught by the police and going to prison or jail for gun possession. Well, that tells us something about an equation and a tipping point we need to address. We'll identify examples now, beginning with the next slide. And these are all examples from a number of jurisdictions that have used high-rate offender lists in one way or another. In St. Louis, they developed what was called the WOW list, the worst of the worst. Offenders knew if they were on the list, and we knew at one point that things were effective when high-rate offenders who weren't on the WOW list, when they were arrested, told the arresting officer, "Don't wow me, man. Don't put me on the WOW list." because they knew individuals on the WOW list were watched, they were stepped up a level at probation or parole, and you can come back and consult the St. Louis information at a later time if you like. This is also information that's available on the SPI website at CNA through some of the PSN interventions. The next slide talks about the Boston Police Department and what they did with impact players. And I know we've got at least one participant from Boston on the line today. And what they found in Boston, and you'll see that 800 individuals down there on the third bullet point, was that they really had a lot of people on that list. Then they worked hard to find ways to winnow the list by area and by jurisdiction, and to provide not just law enforcement, but also other social service interventions and diversion, and involve family members. The next slide talks about what the Lansing Police Department did with the DMI, the drug market intervention, and I mentioned earlier that linking your high-rate offender list to other interventions was a way to enhance the power, and some jurisdictions are trying the drug market intervention, DMI, and your high-rate offender list can be real effectively used in such programs. There's a lot of information about DMI out on the web. BJA is participating in sponsoring a number of sites for training and technical assistance to implement DMI. Baltimore, the next slide, is one of the SPI partners, and they have a really innovative gun offender registry. They use prior weapons offense arrest data and intel to put them on the gun offender registry, and they do lever pulling call-ins off that high-rate offender list. So again, here's a kind of a combination of the drug market intervention, offender call-ins, high-rate offender lists being done by one of the SPI sites in Baltimore that's a little ways down the road and has some, I think, operational information and experience that other newer sites can benefit from. And Savannah as well, the next slide, the Savannah-Chatham Police Department's Impact Project. They looked at the top 100 violent offenders, and if we look at that slide for Savannah and Chatham, they had a regional intel center that they gathered data from, and ended up with the top 100. In what I thought was a real interesting approach, they use the federal sentencing guidelines and the points that are assigned to offense seriousness to offenders based on the number of priors and the current offense seriousness, and that gave them an objective criteria. I think if you called any of these sites, I know if you called any of them, they would be happy to provide additional information, and I think Savannah would probably tell you that 100 was a lot of names, and you probably can be more successful with a smaller list because, again, here's a good SPI principle. You're targeting resources more efficiently. One of the things I liked about Savannah's intervention is that the list was known broadly across the police department, but that the district attorney partnered with them in order to make that intervention more effective and to do what we call keep it fresh. So we'll move on to talk on the next slide a little bit about making your strategy more effective by keeping it fresh. One of the things that we never want to do with SPI is declare victory and go home. I think it's important to keep reassessing our strategy, keep reassessing our data, and one of the things that BJA has called on us to do, and it's a pretty high bar, and it's a pretty stiff challenge, but it's really important, and that's to have outcomes assessment and outcomes analysis of how we're doing. What's our control group? Compared to what? Do we have a time series analysis? Is there another jurisdiction? Is there another set of offenders we can compare ourselves to? And that's one of the things that would lead us to swap out elements that aren't working and introduce new elements, to bring the community in. And I think as well, what we're really interested in the long term is not producing a short-term improvement in public safety and the quality of lives. What we're interested in producing is something that can be sustained. And that sustainability is more likely to occur if we keep our strategy fresh and we analyze what we're doing in a real honest and critical way across all our partners. We move on to the next slide. As we near the end, part of keeping the strategy fresh is revising names, adding them, dropping them, figuring out when there's a nut that we just can't crack or whether we need to change our strategy. I've seen people on these lists whom law enforcement was not as successful as everybody hoped, and what happened was the parole officer started bringing in mothers, wives, and children when they met with the individual for parole meetings, and mom and kids did things that law enforcement weren't able to do in changing the mindset. And sometimes we need to change up the strategy with an individual offender. Keep them guessing. Keep them a little unsure that we're not going to knock on their door at night to make sure they're observing the conditions of their probation or parole. Well, let's move on to the second to the last slide, and that's the big red question mark. We've got 4 questions there that I think are important, and if you're using a high rate offender list, and I think many jurisdictions do, you need to have these questions in front of you. How does this list complement our other strategies? If each of your SPI strategies are in a silo, they don't interact with each other, they don't inform each other, they're not going to be as successful as they can be if they work together, if they complement each other. And it's difficult to do, I'm willing to grant that, but it's really important because it enhances our impact as well as our sustainability. Can we use technology to make our lists most effective? You know, I have the advantage of working in a university where I'm surrounded by really smart 18 and 19-year-olds who know everything about technology that I sure don't. And I often ask them, how do I use the latest app? How do I get this information? How do I find out X, Y, or Z? And I often think we miss that opportunity by not talking to offenders about how they use technology, how they communicate with each other. And certainly as we think about serving warrants, electronic storage devices, hard drives, laptops, thumb drives, but also cell phones are among the most important things that we seize when we serve warrants on offenders. Using that information more broadly, I think, can be really important. Is our community partnership strong enough to involve them? If the community partners are looking at us with one eye closed and shaking their heads every time they hear us talk and doubting us, it's unlikely that we're going to be able to effectively involve them with this kind of intervention. On the one hand, but on the other hand, if they're participating and if they're part of the team and if they're providing good information, they can really enhance our efforts. I know we had an intervention in a neighborhood in St. Louis where there was a guy at a meeting who really was skeptical at the first meeting, and after 3 or 4 months, he would call the police with license plate numbers of cars that were dealing drugs in the neighborhood. He became a very effective part of our information team. And it's also the case that we need to think about how strong our criminal justice system relationships are. There's some jurisdictions where probation and parole don't talk to the police or don't work very effectively with them. Smart policing can help to overcome those hurdles and impediments by demonstrating success at smaller levels and then taking it to scale. Well, we want to take a little bit of time now as we move to the last slide and wrap things up. I want to remind you that the subject matter experts for CNA are available for you through email. If you have questions about this webinar or other webinars or other issues that arise, certainly I find the SPI website to answer a lot of questions and lead me to think about new things. Your partners are certainly available within your jurisdiction as well as across the SPI nation, as it were, for their input. And I guess I'll throw it back to our moderator par excellence here, Chip Coldren, and he can guide us through questions.
Great, Scott. Thank you very much. We do have some time. If anybody has a question for Scott, or if you want to pose a question to the group, please feel free to do so. We have one question that's come up on the chat function here, and it actually has to do with ways to keep in touch with a diverse set of community groups. So if anybody has any experience with that, maybe using technology, maybe using social media, we could talk about that for a few minutes. I do want to emphasize what Scott said. He said it of himself that he's available, and I know he'd be happy to help any site that wants to talk to him in more detail. And we do have a very strong team of subject matter experts that cover all topics in all areas of the country. So feel free to chime in or ask questions or demand something from us.
Chip?
Yeah.
If I might chime in on how do we establish a healthy information exchange with the community issue? Because it's really difficult. I think it can be among the most difficult things we do. And I know we have Hildy Sizo on the phone, and I don't want to take the cop out and say, I know Hildy has the answer, but I do know Hildy has the answer. My experience has been, and Hildy, please chime in, because this is an area of expertise for you, that if we just invite people to a meeting, that's not enough. I've been in jurisdictions where the head of the Urban League, the head of block groups, community groups, pastoral and ministerial groups have been invited, and they may show up once or they don't show up. I've seen district captains go to churches to attend church services and then tell the pastor at the end of the service, we'd really like you at our next meeting. That kind of commitment on the part of law enforcement is really successful in getting reciprocal commitment. I've seen captains. I was at a meeting with the head of an urban league in a large city and a district captain. I was at a meeting with block group captains and a district captain, in which the district captain laid the foundation and the groundwork for a relationship on an individual basis before the group basis occurred. And I have had block group captains say to me, you know, I don't ever see the cops unless they want something. So I'm always a little suspicious when I get invited that they just want something from me and they don't want to listen to me. And I think there's some of that with the community that we have to overcome. But boy, a phone call and a private meeting I've seen go a long way. Hildy, you must have other ideas, I'm sure. No. Or perhaps we move on to other questions.
Just jumping in here, this is Zoe over at CNA. It sounds like Dennis Cullen is speaking about the Philadelphia strategy. I was wondering if maybe he wanted to take the floor for a few minutes and discuss that with the group.
Can you hear me? This is Dennis Cullen.
Yes.
Hi. In Philadelphia, we have about 20 patrol districts. Every district has a police district advisory council. They're usually made up of the leadership of the local neighborhood groups. And some districts have a very large group, 20 to 30. Some have a small, 6 to 8, depending on the size of the neighborhood that district covers. We present things to the community. We let them know what's going on. We involve them. We give them foreknowledge of upcoming events, etc. And we trust that they, in turn, take that back to their community groups. About once a month, these PDACs meet. In addition to that, all the district captains will attend the various community groups within that area. Obviously, you can't attend all of them, especially if you have 20 or 30 in your district area, but if you have somebody from the PDAC on that group, and then you attend their monthly meeting maybe twice a year, the entire community gets to meet the captain, and they also know that the leadership of their group can contact the captain at any time to get information. We also have we have our own web pages now. You can contact the district captains directly, right from the web page and, through emails back and forth, and that's been very successful. And we're going to try a new strategy of which we go into social websites like Facebook and Twitter and provide information in a real-time basis to people as they need to have it. That's what we're doing here.
So you have regular meetings, you provide information, you take feedback. Much easier to think about involving the community when you have a foundation to build on than when you start cold.
Yes, because what we find out too, like somebody had said earlier, that when the police come to the meetings, they want something. It's a lot of times we find it's the opposite. When we're invited to the meetings, it's usually because they're upset about something, and it's usually they're upset about us. So, a lot of times if you don't have this kind of involvement and you walk into a community meeting, there's a great deal of hostility right from the beginning that you have to overcome. If you have an ongoing dialogue with that neighborhood and with that community and with the leadership of that group, it reduces that hostility towards the police. They still may be hostile over, say, a burglary problem, or what we just experienced here in Philadelphia. We had people going around slashing tires over more than a month-long period of time, which really upset a lot of people. When we come to the meeting, yeah, they're upset, but they're not necessarily now upset with the police because they know we've been involved with this from the very beginning. We've given them information. We've increased patrols. We've shown what we can do for them so they don't feel like, oh, well, there's never a cop around when you need one.
Thanks, Dennis. You know what? This is Chip. It occurs to me that there's an interesting link here between the targeted offender list and these community relations. And so I'd like to ask, I know there's a couple sites on the line that responded that they are either using lists or contemplating using them. Has the use of the list prompted a negative community reaction in your experience?
Well, I'm the commanding officer of our criminal intelligence unit, so I'm dealing with lists all the time. Lists are my life. But the one that the community sees most often right now is we put it on our websites, we've given it to the local media, even the cable access channel runs at 24/7, and it's the 100 most wanted felons. So we have warrants on individuals for felony arrests, and we have all their information on the screen, their photos, the warrant, what it's for, and the proviso don't try to take action themselves. They can come to us. That's the most active list that's out there, and we get a very, very positive feedback on that. We generally take off between 25 to 40 people a month off that 100 offenders list, and then, of course, we replace them with another 25 or 40. That's the one that the public deals with most, and they're very, very receptive to that. We have other initiatives that we do where we work with all our partners, such as the district attorney's office and parole probation, juvenile probation, U.S. Attorney's Office, ATF, DEA, and FBI on targeted groups in specific areas. We have one we call GunStat, where we've gridded out 2 areas in the city that have high gun violence because of drug activity, and we're targeting the leadership of those groups. We don't share that necessarily with the public because of the very specific nature of the information that we're dealing with. But and that's been very, very successful when we're working as a partner. And then we break down into smaller action groups with the Detective Division of Occurrence, the district captain. The district attorney's office now has specific assistant DAs assigned right to these groups. We meet on probably about every 2 weeks and go over the list, and when we take off people, the DA's office steps in, tries to get them held on higher bail, targets them for specific prosecution, or if they're in violation of parole or probation, we get those people involved to violate them and get them off the street. The object being, we're dealing with, I think one group referred to it as the worst of the worst. That's who we're dealing with. So we want to get them off the street because we've found a lot of our offenders have 25, 30, or 40 arrests and never do a minute of time in jail. Yeah. Because they're able to intimidate people, the witnesses don't come to court, etc. So we're trying to make it that as soon as we arrest these bad guys, get them into custody right away, get them a high bail, specifically target them for investigation, and give the witnesses a sense that we can protect them because we can control these guys. And we're looking to see how effective that's going to be in the long haul with getting the sentencing that we want to get.
Okay. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think that Holly Tripp has expressed some interest in going ahead and just sharing her experience with these community interactions.
Yes, thank you. My name is Holly Tripp. I'm with the City of Columbia Police Department in Columbia, South Carolina. We have a team that we've put together of officers who regularly talk with community leaders in all of our neighborhoods here in the city and attend all of their community meetings. And occasionally we'll have command staff go along with them just to ensure that we know what's going on in each neighborhood and make sure that we're responsive to concerns and needs.
It's James and Jeff are the two brothers. Yeah, why the other one? That was the first time. I wonder when they moved it. Yeah, they're twins.
Thanks, Holly. Did anyone have any questions for either Dennis or Holly?
Hi, this is Dennis Cohen again. Some people are asking for a number where they can contact me about some of this stuff. My office phone number is 215-685-1153. My email is a bit complicated. It's police.organized_crime@phila.gov, phila.gov. I wish they had a better email, but that's what they gave me.
Very nice. Thank you very much, Dennis. That actually brings us to 11 o'clock, so I think we're going to close it up here. I want to thank Scott again for the work he put into this webinar. It's a ton of really good information, and it's based on a lot of experience that I know he has working with several different sites, working with Project Safe Neighborhoods. So very good to have you on today, Scott. I'm sure we'll have you back. And as I said, there are some other webinars coming up in the next few months. You'll all hear about them. And we hope you'll continue to participate, join with us, learn with us. This is continues to be a very exciting project, and it's really, it gets most exciting when we have all these sites together talking about these issues. So one final thanks to everybody. Vivian and Zoe, thanks for keeping track of things and running the webinar. Thanks for everybody for joining in, and I hope you have a great day today. Take care.
Thank you, Chip. Bye-bye.
Thank you.